Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, welcome everyone to another deep dive. This time we're tackling the Korean War, but not the way you might expect.
Right. No boring history lectures here.
Exactly. We're going beyond dates and battles, looking at the stuff they don't always teach you, the global shock waves this war set off.
It's fascinating, really, how something that seems so far away had these huge ripple effects around the world.
Totally. Like, did you ever think about how a war on a peninsula halfway around the world would end up shaping, like, West Germany joining NATO?
Yeah, or what about the fate of Taiwan, a little island nation caught in the middle of the Cold War?
Exactly. Those connections are what we're digging into today. We've got a stack of sources here, books, articles, even a podcast all about the Korean War and its surprising global legacy. And luckily, we've got our expert here to help us unpack it all.
Happy to be here. Always up for a good deep dive into history.
So, big picture, what are we dealing with here? What's the main story when it comes to the Korean War and its global impact?
Well, I think the Korean War, in many ways, is where theory collides with reality. You know, before Korea, containing communism was this idea, a policy being debated in Washington.
Right, like, okay, how do we stop this thing from spreading?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Korea forces a choice. It becomes the first real test of this containment idea, and suddenly the U.S. has to put its money where its mouth is on a global scale.
Yeah, it's no longer just talk. It's American soldiers on the ground fighting and dying halfway around the world. So for those who might need a refresher, June 25th, 1950, North Korea invades South Korea, and that's when everything changes.
Absolutely, and I think one of the sources, it was a podcast actually, made a really good point about this being the first time the U.S. flexed its muscles like this in an actual shooting war.
It was like, okay, we've been talking about containment, now we're actually doing it. High stakes.
Definitely high stakes. And
Yeah.
you know, speaking of things that made people nervous back then, we have to talk about this NSC 68 document.
Oh yeah, this thing is like looking into a crystal ball, a really expensive, top-secret crystal ball. For our listeners, this NSC 68, it was like this blueprint for America's Cold War strategy.
Drafted before the Korean War even started, right?
Yeah, it basically called for a massive increase in U.S. military spending, like wartime levels of funding, to counter the Soviet threat. And even President Truman wasn't totally sold on it at first.
Which is understandable. It was a huge financial commitment.
Yeah, like, do we really need to be spending this much money? But then Korea happened.
And boom, suddenly, that expensive report. It becomes the justification for everything.
It's like the war gave them the "we told you so" moment.
Yeah.
And it totally shifted the conversation in Washington.
100%. It's almost like the Korean War gave them permission to implement this grand vision they had outlined in NSC 68.
Yeah, to take containment from this idea to like a full-blown global military strategy. And it's interesting because when you really dig into it, the impact of the Korean War, it goes way beyond Korea.
Oh, absolutely. It's like throwing a rock into a pond, but instead of ripples, you get these huge waves that just keep going.
And those waves, they circle the globe. Like, let's talk about Western Europe for a second. 1955, West Germany joins NATO. Now, I'm no historian, but that can't be a coincidence, right?
Not at all. The timing is too perfect. You see, the Soviet Union had formed its own military alliance, the Warsaw Pact, and West Germany joining NATO was a direct response to that.
So the Korean War, even though it was half a world away, it had a huge impact on the balance of power in Europe.
Absolutely. It showed that the West, the U.S. in particular, was willing to use military force to contain communism. And that sent a very clear message to countries like West Germany who were trying to figure out where they stood in this whole Cold War mess.
It's like, okay, things just get real.
Yeah, the stakes were raised, and the Korean War was the turning point.
And it wasn't just Europe, right? I mean, the sources make it clear that this wasn't just a European face-off.
Oh, absolutely not. The Korean War really kind of blew the whole thing wide open, geographically speaking.
It's like someone hit the globalize button on this whole Cold War struggle. And speaking of global, we got to talk about Taiwan.
Right. Taiwan is, it's interesting how the sources really highlight how much the Korean War affected this small island.
It's a trip, right? Like, before Korea, Taiwan wasn't really on everyone's radar, but then...
Suddenly they're front and center.
Yeah, because containing communism wasn't just about holding the line in Europe anymore. It was about these strategic points all over the globe.
Yeah.
And Taiwan, right there off the coast of China, that's huge.
Absolutely. It became a crucial asset, like a linchpin in this whole fight against communism.
Right.
The U.S. starts pouring support into Taiwan, bolstering their defenses, recognizing them as the legitimate government of China.
Which is a whole other can of worms.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it makes sense in the context of this globalized Cold War
Yeah.
and the Korean War. It really set the stage for that.
It's wild. So, okay, we've got alliances forming, we've got strategic positions being reinforced. I mean, the impact of this limited war, it's anything but limited. But, what I found really interesting as I was going through all this was how historians view the Korean War today.
Oh, yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it?
It's like everyone's got a different take on what went down and why.
Well, that's history for you.
Right.
It's not just about what happened. It's about how we make sense of it all, even decades later.
It's like everyone's looking at the same painting but seeing something totally different.
100%.
Like, for example, you've got some historians, the, what do they call them? The Orthodox school of thought. They see the Korean War as this clear-cut case of good guys versus bad guys.
Right. The U.S. riding in to save the day, halting communist aggression. Very black and white.
Exactly. And for them, it was totally justified. Like, any sign of weakness, and boom, the dominoes start falling.
Exactly. The domino theory was huge back then.
But then you've got the revisionists coming in with a much more skeptical view. It's like they're saying, hold on a minute, maybe the U.S. had its own agenda here.
Right. Like maybe it wasn't just about saving the world from communism.
Exactly. Maybe it was also about, like, power and influence for the U.S.
Economic interests, geopolitical maneuvering, that kind of thing.
Right. And suddenly it's not so black and white anymore.
Much more nuanced.
And then, just to make things even more interesting, you've got the post-revisionists. They're like, hey, everybody chill out. Maybe it wasn't a big conspiracy or a morality play.
Yeah, they're more about the complexities, the unintended consequences, the fog of war, so to speak.
Right. Like, maybe it was just a messy situation fueled by Cold War paranoia on both sides.
Exactly. Miscommunication, miscalculations, that kind of thing.
And then, to top it all off, after the Cold War ends, some historians get access to these Soviet archives.
Game changer. Talk about a plot twist. They're like, hold up, Stalin wasn't exactly gung-ho about starting a war with the U.S.
Right. It's amazing the insights we can gain when we have access to all sides of the story. It's like suddenly the whole narrative shifts. So we've got all these different interpretations, all these different perspectives. It's enough to make your head spin. For someone like me who's just trying to make sense of it all, what's the takeaway?
Well, I think that's the beauty and the challenge of studying history, right?
There's no easy answers.
Exactly. There's rarely a single definitive answer. It's more about understanding the context, the different viewpoints, and recognizing that our understanding of the past, it's always evolving.
It's amazing how much one event, like the Korean War, can be seen in so many different ways depending on who's doing the looking.
It really highlights the whole idea that history is less about absolute truth and more about how we interpret the past.
Totally. But even with all these different interpretations, one thing that really jumps out from the sources is this idea of, like, the globalization of containment.
Ah, yes. Containment goes global. It's like the ghost of the Korean War that ends up shaping U.S. foreign policy for decades.
Right. Because before Korea, containment was mostly about Europe.
Right. Containing communism in Europe. That was the main focus.
But after Korea, it's like, okay, we have to fight communism everywhere.
Everywhere. From Vietnam to Cuba to Latin America, it became this all-encompassing mission.
It makes you wonder, though, did it actually work? Like, did this globalization of containment actually make the world a safer place?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's tough to say for sure. I mean, you could argue that it was necessary.
Like the Korean War showed that, yeah, communist expansion was a real thing.
Exactly. And the U.S. had to take a stand somewhere, draw a line in the sand.
But then there's the flip side.
Right. And it's a big flip side.
This whole idea of containment, it kind of dragged the U.S. into a lot of conflicts they might not have gotten involved in otherwise.
Yeah, Vietnam being the big one, obviously. But there are plenty of other examples, too. Interventions in Latin America, Africa. It went on and on.
So it's kind of a mixed bag, right? Like, yeah, maybe it stopped the spread of communism in some places.
But at what cost?
Exactly. Millions dead, countries destroyed, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation.
It's a tough pill to swallow, for sure.
No kidding. And it really makes you think about the unintended consequences of, well, pretty much everything. Like, even with the best intentions, things can go sideways.
Oh, absolutely. History is full of those cautionary tales.
Isn't that the truth? Well, on that cheerful note, big thanks to our expert for walking us through all of this. It's been enlightening, to say the least.
Glad to be here. Always happy to dive into a good historical debate.
And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us for another deep dive. We'll catch you next time when we hopefully uncover something a little less, potentially world-ending. Until then, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.